All right, so we're going to pick up again with Commissioner Fitzko from the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. We're going to turn our attention now to the Forest Future Strategic Roadmap. And we'll hear all about where that came from and where it is and where it's going. So,
yes. For the record, Danielle Fitzko, Interim Commissioner for the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Thank you for having me back. I think this follows up really well to the conversation that you had last week when you had a bunch of individuals talking about the forest economy and their roles. I did just want to share, I'm so glad you got to meet Keith. He's one of our amazing teammates in FPR. So we have a whole bunch of great talent that we're happy to bring in anytime. And certainly Keith is our lead on private lands, which, as you know, is 80% of the land base. He's got a big responsibility. He also mentioned some publications, forest carbon, and then oh no, actually you didn't mention forest carbon, restoring old growth characteristics. And then we have another one on forest carbon. I left some on the table there for you, so you can pick them up if you'd like. And I think I'll just follow up on the question that was asked about how we manage state lands. We have 360,000 acres of lands that A&R manages, and we have a team in each of 5 districts that work together to understand the land base, do assessments, develop a plan that considers different land use classifications. So it's either high use like a state park, or it could be highly sensitive like an area like an ESTA that you would not want to go in there and do any sort of active management on. But there is a class like general management where that would be an area that you would consider for forest management. So as a team at a district level of foresters, recreation specialists, water quality, fisheries, wildlife biologists get together and they really look at the land as a whole and consider the best uses. And it's public land, so we take it out for public comment and we get a lot of input that helps us develop long-range management planning. So there are areas that are not being proposed for any management because of its ecological values. That help answer that one?
I think so. Representative O'Brien, was it your question originally? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to switch to the Vermont Forest Future Strategic Roadmap. And this is something that we've been working on for several months now. This was actually initiated last year. The legislature passed Act 183, and it charged the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation to develop Vermont Forest Future Strategic Roadmap, which is a 10-year vision for the forest economy sector and the greater forest economy, looking at how to strengthen, modernize, promote, and protect that sector. I don't need to tell you why forest and forest products. I tell this community's got a real understanding of the value of forests, that forests matter, people working in the forest for our economy. You know wood is good, you know local wood is even better. We talked about the economic benefits. This is real that we have 74% forested and that we really want to have a thriving forest economy into the future. You would think right now, recognizing that we have a renewable resource, that we're thinking about our future and climate smart solutions, that the wood products sector would be feeling like really optimistic right now, that this should be their time, but they're not feeling that, at least not across the whole supply chain. I'm not saying there's not some bright spots, because there are, but across the whole supply chain, there's definitely some areas that really need to have some attention. I was really fortunate when we kicked off this roadmap to do what we call roundtables around the state. So I went to 5 different locations, brought in stakeholders across the forest products sector, and we just listened to them and said, what's going on? And some of the things that we heard were, and I think you heard this last week, is workforce is a challenge. We have an aging workforce. Maybe we have they're paying well, but they're not getting new workers. And then we're not seeing the next generation coming in. So that's a real challenge when we're starting to think about, what does this look like 10 years from now? The cost, yeah.
What 5 places did you go to? I'm just curious, what areas?
Yeah, so we went around the state. We started in Linden, we went to Barry, we went to Brattleboro, we went to Rutland, and we went to Burlington. So in 3 days, it was, it was actually so awesome. We sat around a table and had a great conversation. We talked about, we heard costs, that the rising costs of doing business, the equipment is very expensive, and with inflation, it's just going up. The profit margins are really decreasing. We heard changing landowners. I mean, we've seen since the pandemic, and we're seeing it's not seeming to slow down, new landowners coming to Vermont, not necessarily understanding the working landscape, the strong land ethic that we have here in Vermont. Maybe they don't understand logging trucks going down the roads or the hours of operation. Just something that we just need to recognize that there's an opportunity for education and outreach.
Sorry to interrupt. The 5 meetings that you mentioned, were they with a cross-section of the entire forest products industry, or
Yep.
was it loggers or
We had
foresters?
landowners, foresters, loggers, truckers, primary manufacturers, secondary manufacturers, we had recreation interests. We had educators that were doing like forest product innovation. So we tried to get those that are directly connected as the first tier of public engagement. This process, and I'm going to share with you our public engagement, it's very transparent. We want to make sure that we hear from the sector, but we also take it out broader, because this is a Vermont plan for 10 years from now. We heard losing forests, and I think you've heard this as well in testimony that we can't go, it's harder to go, we don't want to go down. We're at 74% now, we're starting to lose forests. We estimate between 12,000 and 14,000 acres a year being converted to non-forest use. Every time we take land and convert it to non-forest, we lose the goods and services that forests provide. So that's just a concern going forward, not to mention parcelization, so more landowners, and fragmentation, where we're losing some of the intact forest. This is coming out clear that there's a misunderstanding of forest management. There seems to be some societal polarization that forest management is bad. And we really should be celebrating in Vermont the gold standard of forest management that we have. As Keith talked about, 2 million acres are enrolled in UVA. That means they have a forest management plan by a licensed forester, that our team is like looking over those plans. Just to recognize that we really have a great cohort of forestry professionals in the state doing it really well, and that it's a renewable resource, something that we should be celebrating, that we do it right. We heard from them the regulations. We know that forest-based businesses have a conservation effect on the landscape. They help keep forests forested. But there are some barriers to starting up forest-based businesses or expanding those. And we heard that we're losing in-state capacity to process wood. Wood needs to leave the state to get processed. Some of it comes back. At one point, we had hundreds of mills. I think we've talked about this in the past. We're down to maybe 20 in the state. So I could actually keep going on about all this kind of things that we heard, because there's definitely some challenges. But I'm going to switch now to the opportunity that we have right now with the development of the Forest Future Strategic Roadmap. And so this was initiated, I'd say that probably the origin was back in 2021, when the Rural Caucus was working with then Commissioner Snyder to develop a learning tour about the forest economy. So that summer of 2021, we did tours all across the state to meet individuals that are across the supply chain, where they are at, in their mills, in the forests, in the manufacturing facility. And that's where the idea was started, that we needed to have a Forest Future Strategic Roadmap, which is really a model from agricultural community with the farm to plate. So with the passing of Act 183, it charged FPR with creating this 10-year vision with actionable strategies that the legislature requested. So we were able to actually, we are very fortunate that there was some funding associated with this request. And we had $250,000 and we hired a contractor. And we now have a contractor on board called Future IQ that is a resource-based planner and community planner. And they really have worked globally. And if you listen to their name, Future IQ, they really are helping us to think 10 years from now, which is, you kind of think about like what's happening right now, but really think about how do we set ourselves up for 10 years to have a thriving forest products sector and greater forest economy. So you may have heard this, but we certainly have heard this when we were developing, starting to get this plan together, that we've been here before, we have plans, and actually we identified 79 plans that mention the forest economy. And I'm out there talking to those directly involved. I'm really saying this one is different. And that's because this is the first one that was requested by the legislature. And that tells the community that you're invested in what the forest products economy, the greater forest economy looks in 10 years from now. It's also a request that we provide actionable strategies back to you. So you're telling the community that what do we do? You want to hear from them. And I also think what makes it different is that this is really looking out into the future, that you're saying in 10 years from now, we don't want it to just be the same. We want to see a thriving forest economy, and you're looking for opportunities to invest and take action.
Okay.
You want to go back and look at
No.
this?
What's he doing?
Oh, he's marking a tree.
Okay. Vigor or something. I don't know.
Spray gun of blue pen.
I thought this was good because it's also a younger individual working in the woods in the future. So I'll give you a little bit of a beat on our planning process because we're heavily engaged right now in the early phases of the planning and engagement process. We are due to have draft recommendations to the General Assembly July of this year. So it's actually a pretty short timeline by the time that it was enacted to get, state process to get a contract in place. We got the contract in place. And then by January of 2024, we'll have a final report to you. I also want to share that FPR is the lead on this, but we also entered into a partnership agreement with the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund because they are heavily invested in being supporting the forest product sector. And they certainly have experience working in the agricultural community. So Christine McGowan, who testified last week, is working with the FPR core team as a partner to help support this initiative. So the way our planning process is unfolding is we are exploring perceptions as the first phase. So that was the roundtable. We went out and we listened. We put out a survey that just closed on the 31st of January that asked all Vermonters to contribute. And we said all Vermonters who use forest products. So I'm hoping that was all Vermonters. And we actually got 700 responses, which I think is really pretty good because the average person spent about 30 minutes filling out the survey. So this wasn't like a couple clicks. They really spent a lot of time, thoughtful time in responding to us. And we also looked at all those 79 reports, right? Didn't want to miss anything that has been called for in the past. So we did a whole review of those. Then we're in this process right now. I'll give you a little bit of a preview of where we're going. We've identified what the future could look like. What are the possible future scenarios? And what are the implications of those? And where do we want to sort of steer the trajectory of where we go in the future? Then we'll develop our draft recommendations, and then we'll have future summits to test those recommendations. And then once we have the final recommendations, we will also go out again and start to build support for those recommendations. So as the legislature asked for, we have a 22-member advisory panel. That's from landowners, foresters, loggers, manufacturers, conservation groups, education institutions. They're meeting monthly to help guide the process. Our engagement process, as I mentioned, is pretty robust. We did that first series of roundtables. We did one survey, there'll be another survey. We had a think tank, and I'll give you a little bit more about what the think tank is. At the end of this month, we will be going out for community input, so broad public input. Then we're going to go back to the stakeholder group and get their input. We're going to be meeting with state agencies to just get, where do they see that they can play and what are the barriers they're seeing, and then outreach. So it's a lot, but really good and important engagement that we're doing with this process. What you see here is part of step one of the think tank. And in order for us to think 10 years out, our contractor asked us to say, what are the key drivers that are changing our future? And the advisory panel identified 22 key drivers. Everything from what is the future condition of the forest to what is the generational shift in values? Because 10 years from now, it's most likely not going to be the same decision makers. What does the workforce look like? What happens if this polarization of forest management continues? What does innovation look like? What does outdoor recreation look like? So we identified all these different areas could influence what the forest product looks like in 10 years from now. So we took, there's Lucy again. So then I don't expect that you're going to understand this chart right here, but what? And so those are the 22 drivers. And then the advisory panel ranked them in different categories, and some of them were raised as being more important key drivers for the future. And so they did all this data analysis behind the scenes. And what they came up with, could be a little confusing too, is what are the future splitting questions that could change the trajectory of our future? And they came up with two. How do we manage our forests? You can either do none, or you can be really intentional, a whole spectrum. And what is the industry adaptation over the next 10 years? We don't adapt, we stay the same, or we get really intentional and we start making some changes. And so this was part of think tank too. We brought 40 people together and to explore those different scenarios in 4 different boxes. So if on the bottom left, it would be you're not adapting and we're not going to do very much forest management. On the top right, we're adapting and we're thinking about how we manage the forest. And those groups did a lot of work, but they came up with some headlines for those major 4 categories. On the bottom left, it's good trees to look at as a headline. The top, if we were to have industry adaptation, but we're not doing very much on forest management, it would be small companies, but sad woods. On the top right was growing a prosperous Vermont forests. And then on the bottom would be forest strong. So this is sort of just identifying these are plausible futures. And then we asked the group to identify what is the least desirable future, what is the future that was most likely if we do nothing, and what is the desired future. And the desired future comes up somewhere in that growing a prosperous Vermont forest is where we think we could go. So what happens now is that was a group of 40 people. That's the community engagement piece now. So we take that sort of desired future and test it with both the stakeholder groups and the broader public. It's this is sort of where we want to go. And then we'll come up with our final desired future condition. And then we'll start to build pillars of strategies and start to build those strategies that will move us into that direction. We are looking at holding a meeting, I think it may be March 1st or 2nd, through the Rural Caucus, and would like to invite this committee and other committees to actually weigh in on these desired future condition. Because we want to get some broad input, and certainly you're going to be key in helping us implement this vision once we've sort of developed the plan. So we want to make sure you're part of the process. So that's sort of where we're at right now. We've kind of done step one. We're in the middle of step two. We've done the think tank, and now we're going to go out and get some input on that. We'll put out another survey. And then step three will be once we've sort of really told the story of what that desired future condition looks like, then we'll start to build out that roadmap for 10 years from now.
Cool.
What gives me hope about this is it's been so fortunate to be able to get out and meet all the people involved. Certainly I've worked with them, but there is a lot of grit, a lot of passion, a lot of innovation, and they're buying into this process. That gives me a lot of hope. I also think the collective us, when I look at the individuals that are showing up and I look at the work that you're doing here, that I think together we can really make some progress to have a thriving forest products economy into the future. And then I just think about our future forests. There's so much opportunity for us to be really strategic in what it looks like 10 years from now. And I think we're going to have a roadmap that's going to tell us how to get there. And that this process, I think, is really valuable. And I'm really grateful that we have this opportunity to build it well, with a lot of engagement and the resources to do it. So that, we've been asking this question to participants, what would be different, 10 years from now if we're successful? And it's been great to hear the answers. And I am hearing optimism once they start to engage in the process. So that is the Vermont Forest Future Roadmap. By June, we'll be coming back with some draft recommendations. Then hopefully we can tag you in March for your thoughts.
You sound excited about the process, which is good to know, good to hear. And you're feeling confident about the timeline. You mentioned that it was a tight timeline and that we've got by the end of June or sometime in July anyway, recommendations are due. Feeling good about that?
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not constant pressure because it's been a lot of good work. But we're on point to get it done. There's going to be a lot of meetings coming up, but our contractor is fantastic, and our core team at FPR with Sustainable Jobs Fund and the advisory panel, everyone's digging in.
Representative Templeman?
So this is regarding conflicting interests. So there are programs and groups we're hearing from that foresee a future of agriculture and increasing the amount of acreage under agriculture. And you're describing first a cautionary note about the loss of forest, but also increased management and this point that you're if we don't maintain our forests, we're losing an industrial base. So with these competing interests, agriculture, I mean, of course, development's that's the big one. Mm-hmm. But if we are to increase our agricultural base to achieve our food independence goals, we may have to be taking back agricultural lands from forests that exist now. How do you see that balance working out in a positive way for this program, for your plan?
Yeah, I think it's real, and we need to be aware of that. And I think if we look at what's currently going on, we do lose forest every year. The worst is when we lose it to pavement and development, or at least where that's happening. It's the pattern of that we want to be careful of. Growth in downtowns, that's where we want to focus our efforts. And I think the state has certainly identified that as a strategy. And I think with agriculture, I think it's also that we have to have food security is something we need. We just have to look at that balance and where it makes the most sense. There is other initiatives when we're looking at the landscape of where, and I think it's good to have some areas that are in, not passively managed. We want the majority to be actively managed. I think we want to try and keep as much forest as we can, also respecting that we also need to have food. So I think it's part of it. And a lot of times we're actually seeing agriculture revert to forests too each year.
Representative Rice?
So 10-year plan, 10 years maybe is a decent chunk of time in terms of the forest products industry, but not a long time in forest
No,
life.
right.
So I'm just wondering how this process engages with the idea of that the forest products future and the next 10 years, maybe the 10 years after that, how it interfaces with the idea of the forests in Vermont and their next 100 years or 500 years.
Yeah, if you notice, one of the future splitting questions was about forest management, and one of the key pillars underneath that was forest condition. And I think that was underlying that we want healthy forests going into the future. So I think the timeline is about the forest product sector, but the underlying is that in the future, we want to have healthy, sustainably managed forests. And I think the goal with this is that we're going to keep revisiting this every 10 years, but we didn't want to lose sight that healthy, resilient, intact forests are key to the success of the industry itself. So at one point, when we get past the desired future, we'll probably have a pillar that focuses on, how do we make sure that we're maintaining that forest, keeping forest strong.
Representative Lipsky?
Yeah. Danielle, thank you. And I am energized by your positive enthusiasm and the work of your advisory panel and the entire initiative. On one of your earlier slides, one looked like Wayne Coda up on a log loader, but there was some polka dots and it said something about perceptions. So I'm starting with the positive, but I'm going to focus on a little concern as we move forward in this strategic plan. And it has started this spring in various news outlets and this summer, and it prompted me to reach out to former Commissioner Snyder when there were protests in Rochester and some of Green Mountain National Forests that with sort of, to me, seemed far-fetched, accusatory, call it propaganda or rhetoric. And after seeing this for a month or two, and I called Commissioner Snyder, and I said, I'm concerned about some of this rhetoric. And he said, well, you ought to be, Jed. It's sort of grinding us to a halt here. So one thing, and he's a deep scientist, a deep thinker, and as engaged as anyone in the state of Vermont in forest futures and values. Are we doing anything? And he basically said we've been ground to a halt as far as timber sales and, interventions or lawsuits, particularly on the small segment of Camel's Hump that's under an existing management plan. What does the forest futures, what are they doing to try to, we have no voice. Bloggers say, oh, that's BS, or well, what are you talking about? An old forest is an 80-year-old Norway spruce plantation. What are you as FPR and, the professionals, the leadership first state doing to try to, without being confrontational, sort of counter some of this false narrative, which I think ultimately could be very destructive to this 10-year strategic plan.
Yes, I agree. That is why one of the key drivers was societal polarization, because that was the recognition that there's a misunderstanding of forest management, and there's a lot of energy behind that initiative. And I don't know what the strategies are going to be to address that, because we haven't gotten there yet for this plan. I think one of our strongest things that we do as a department is talk about the values of forest management, the values of forest, and how well we do it in Vermont. I think we probably could do a lot better. Maybe there'll be communications work that can come out of this to really tell the story and educate. I think there's definitely some cherry picking of some science going on. And I think we just need to raise awareness about that forest management. I can't talk too much about what's going on in state lands because we are in litigation right now. But I think if we don't do forest management right here, we push it out elsewhere. And that's just the reality, because forest products are every part of our lives. And so I think we just need to maybe draw that connection and understanding of that. So I think a lot of it is going to be education and grounded in science.
Thank you. And a little follow-up on David Templeman's question, and I think you may have, it was pointed out about, do we need to clear forests or convert forests into ag land? There was a huge sector of former active ag land. It may be goldenrod, blackberries, and a few pioneers, sort of recently abandoned farmland that can be brought back into cultivation or productivity. And that's, I think, the focus area. No one is proposing to cut existing forest land to expand ag land. Is that correct?
I think I heard Sam Lincoln mention last week he was actually working on a conversion to ag land. And I think that when we're looking across the landscape, that we need to be thoughtful about, I think natural and working lands is very important to Vermont, and that includes agriculture and forest land.
Representative Templeman.
And just a quick little note on that, these two things don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. Forestry and ag can work in conjunction, silvopasture, for example. That's my 2 cents.
Wow, that was the fastest. Wow. And so right to the point. Thank you. That was great.
It occurs to me also that we may, the committee may want to hear from, and there may be others out in the larger community who would like us to hear from them with who might be interested in presenting their perspective on the Campbell's Hump situation, for example, or others that may be consider themselves, conservationists, traditional conservationists, and have a different perspective. So that might be helpful for the committee to hear from at some point too.
I would say for public lands, it's public lands to meet a variety of uses. And there are some public lands we do have passively managed, we have some actively managed, we have some heavily used areas where we invite the public to, like state parks. And so it's broad, and it's a thoughtful planning process that we go through with the public and through natural resource assessments.
Representative O'Brien.
Oh, no.
Representative Pearl.
I was just wondering if you could talk at all about, so it feels like in previous conversations, there's been some barriers for, I'm thinking about production, like sawmills in the state. And I'm not too familiar on it, and so I'm wondering if it would be helpful for me and for the rest of the committee with our relationship to the north with Canada. There's some sort of subsidy program
Right.
that makes it cheaper for them to saw wood, like especially mostly all hardwood goes north. And there's obviously a reason for that. I wondered if you could just talk to that a little bit and explain it.
Yeah, we should probably bring in Paul Frederick, who's our forest economy specialist, who can kind of give you all the wood flows. I think gave me some numbers. We harvest about 120 million board feet. I think 69% of that leave Vermont. And a good portion does cross over into Quebec. and about a couple percent actually go abroad. But there is a and maybe Keith, do you know more about, I'm not supposed to, right?
Danielle, when you say 60-some% leaves the state, is that in the form of roundwood?
So that would be,
Logs versus?
yeah, logs.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's logs.
yeah, about 50%, so it's 69, 40, so it's about 50% leave.
That 50%
Yeah.
leave is roundwood.
Representative O'Brien.
Danny, you're talking about this roadmap, like we're here right now, not a necessarily healthy situation. We want to get to this 10-year point. When you're looking at other places, whether it's other states in New England, other states in general, or even, Scandinavian countries, Commissioner Snyder talked a lot about Sweden. There. Are there places that, without reinventing the wheel, we can kind of look at and say, like, they kind of got this right. Like, they were at our point and now they're where we want to be.
Well, there is an initiative that's happened in Maine where they're several years ahead of us, and they've been able to bring in a lot of attention and investors into businesses. They have a new insulation company that started with wood products, and so and that has been because it's called 4MAP, we're sort of modeling that program, but I'd say they're 5-6 years ahead of us, but they are seeing some change from that.
Yeah.
But it's just also recognize that we're doing this for Vermont, but we need to have, it's a regional really conversation. So hopefully that will come as well, because it's not just about Vermont in reality, the way wood moves.
Other questions? All right, well.
Just a little follow-up.
Yes, please, go ahead.
I mean, one thing, like, we only have one high-quality pellet mill in the state, for example. Seems like we could have more, or we could have a state-of-the-art rye gate instead of a really old rye gate. I mean, so these questions about, maybe it's not even in the age of lager, maybe it's just like massive amounts of venture capital and all of a sudden things turn around.
Yeah, we're going to be exploring what it could look like. And one of the things we have been talking about, it's been coming up, is what is the Vermont scale? Like, it's community scale. Maybe we need to have more pellet mills across the state. Every county has one. So then you're supporting that community woodshed. So that there's just been kind of discussions about that, but we really haven't gotten into sort of those strategies that we'll be recommending going forward.
Did somebody last week mention a second pellet facility?
Yeah, I think, yeah. I don't know where that one is.
Somewhere up further north.
I heard it though too.
Yeah. And then I think you mentioned Paul Frederick, was that the name?
Yep,
And he's in the department,
he is in the department.
forest economist?
He is, yes.
Okay, good. We'll make a note of that and see if he's able to join us.
He can rattle off the numbers pretty easily.
Great, okay.
He's been at it for 38 years.
Okay.
You know,
Representative Lipsky.
this is, and I don't want to misstep my humble role, but to John O'Brien's question about modeling after Scandinavia, in some ways we are. They invented and created a low impact system of harvesting 45 years ago called cut to length, using log forwarders. Mind you, there are 9 million people in Sweden, and there's a vast timber resources, part of the universal culture there. And even there are state contracts that require cut to length forwarding, low ground pressure, able to operate more sensitively. So Vermont has adapted some of the systems and in fact required on certain harvests. So those are positive, learned experience from pioneers, pioneer leaders in forest management. So there are positive things there. We cannot change the cultural or ideological, the ownership patterns, and as Danielle pointed out, the rapidly changing land ownership with different values. The Quebec government, both provincial government and national government, as well as Ontario, had for years valued industry and employment. So they are happy to buy wood from south of the border, AKA Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, and aggressively. And they do subsidize industry. They feel there are positive impacts on their economy. That's a different ideology than we function under. So that is a challenge for us.
Okay, all right, well, with that then, thank you very much for walking us through the plan.
Yeah.
That's a new word.
What's that?
Walking us or swalking us?
Walking us through, yeah.
Thank you for having us.